Jonathan Swan of Axios finally got Jared Kushner to talk on camera, and Jonathan Swan made the most of it, including asking about Donald Trump lying about President Barack Obama's birthplace.
Was birtherism racist?
Look, I wasn't really involved in that.
I know you weren't. Mm-hmm. Was it racist?
Like I said, I wasn't involved in that.
I know you weren't. Mm-hmm. Was it racist?
Look, I know who the president is, and I have not seen anything in him that is racist. So again, I was not involved in that.
Did you wish he didn't do that?
Like I said, I was not involved in that. That was a long time ago.
Jonathan Swan also asked Jared Kushner about the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was a critic of Jared Kushner's friend Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia has admitted that Saudi agents strangled and dismembered Khashoggi. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity value burying the dead. Will you join Khashoggi's fiancée in calling on the Saudi government to release his body to his family or identify where they've put the body parts so his loved ones might give him, if not a timely burial, at least a burial?
Look, it's a horrific thing that happened, and what we've done is we've called for full transparency. We're working on an investigation to get to the bottom of what happened.
Should they return the body?
Once we have all the facts, then we'll make policy determinations, but that'll be up to the Secretary of State to kind of push on our policy, and we'll do everything we can to try to bring transparency and accountability for what happened.
Michael Wolff is back with us. His new book is full of news about Jared Kushner. It goes on sale tomorrow. Siege, Trump Under Fire. Jared Kushner is a major character in this book, and I'm sure you are not at all. I don't think any reader of your book would be surprised that Jared Kushner cannot even answer the question, should the Saudis return the body?
At some level, Jared was, and let's choose the word carefully, I'm going to retreat from this because I'm going to end up saying he was complicit in this, and I'm sure that on an actual level is not true, but on a support level, on a friendship level. Would MBS have murdered Khashoggi if he didn't know that he had the absolute support of Jared Kushner in this White House? I don't know, but he certainly did have the absolute support. And in fact, there's a point in the book where after Khashoggi is murdered and the White House doesn't know how to respond, and Jared calls up MBS and says, I think you better execute all those guys very quickly, the guys who actually were the executioners of Khashoggi.
What's the sourcing on that? I mean, you admit in your sourcing of the book that a lot of the people who were sources for your first book are no longer working in the White House, like Steve Bannon and others who could be physically close. I got to say, when I read a lot of the Jared Kushner passages, it almost seems like Jared Kushner would be the source since he's one of the two people in the room. But the material is so negative to Jared Kushner.
Well, I'm not going to I'm not going to discuss the sources on this. The sources are. Except to say that the sources would have heard this from one of the participants.
People in the room. The president, I mean, you're reluctant to put names to Jared Kushner or what he does, but the president, I read in here, has nicknames for everyone, just as a lot of people in this book. We now learn about what John Kelly calls Donald Trump. In your first book, we learned about all sorts of names that everyone was calling Donald Trump.
Everybody is calling everybody else a name, and I assume that sort of begins with Trump. It's the ultimate defense. You have to be calling someone names because he's calling everyone names.
And they're all calling Donald Trump crazy. They're all calling him out of control, stupid, all those kinds of things.
Let's go even, because I think it's an important point. Anybody who has had contact with Donald Trump comes away thinking that there's something wrong with him. Mm-hmm. And that's putting it in a nice way.
And there's a point in the book where Donald Trump, in one of his many points of frustration with Jared Kushner, at the end of his complaint about Jared Kushner, says, "What a girl." He refers to him as a girl, and for Donald Trump, that is about the most negative thing he can say about anyone.
Exactly.
How does that relationship work, where the president doesn't respect him in your account?
Well, it's a very important relationship. It's really key because remember, he's the only person who has managed to go the distance so far in this White House. Everybody else who began
and
is
his wife,
out.
the president's daughter.
Yes, and that's why.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the reason Jared gets to go the distance? Because he is married to Ivanka, the only person. I think that she is singular in this regard, who the president doesn't disparage.
And you make the point that the president wants loyalty, he wants devotion, and then when he gets it, he doesn't trust you. He thinks less of you when you deliver the kind of devotion and service that he wants.
You know, this is to say the very least, a difficult man to work with. To go a little further than this is a crazy person.
And that's a continuation of what was in your first volume of this study of Trumpism. And you presented at the beginning as a bit more than anything else a continuing psychological profile of Donald Trump, of who this man is and how his mind works, which in your view I take to be the most important thing about what you can find in your studies of this, is how does the president's mind work?
I think that's crucial. I mean, I think ultimately 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 10 years from now, we're not going to be talking about the president's policies. We're going to be talking about who this man is. How did this possibly happen? How could a person like this find himself in the position that he's found himself in? And what does this, what does this mean? How do you tell the story about this? I mean, one of the interesting things is I think the dominant narrative now is that Donald Trump is the strong man. Donald Trump is the guy who's going to burn through everybody else. Donald Trump is the guy who's going to get what he wants. Whereas I think actually the narrative is Donald Trump is melting down. Every day it gets stranger and stranger. Every day he's more alone. Every day someone else deserts him. Every day he does something that is more peculiar, less logical, and has to be undone by someone else.
What do your sources tell you about what Donald Trump thinks of Robert Mueller? And did that change over time?
He thought from the beginning he could take Robert Mueller. He says, I know this guy. I know this kind of guy. He's too straight. And as I said, he's got no game. And I think he sensed that. He sensed this as a weakness in the special prosecutor. He sensed that he could be, by saying witch hunt, witch hunt, witch hunt. He could be the person that Robert Mueller would say, this is a crazy man, and how to predict what a crazy man will do, and that's a scary thing. I mean, at one point, Steve Bannon says about Mueller. This is after the report is filed. Bannon says
the Mueller report becomes public.
Yes.
Steve Bannon sees the results,
and he says, "Never send a Marine to do a hitman's job." And I think that he sees this as Steve understood, Robert Mueller is there as an institutional guy to protect an institution. And Donald Trump is perfectly willing to destroy an institution.
In an institution that relies on norms, in a town that relies on norms, in addition to laws, the point, it seems, at the end of your account of this, is that someone who plays by the rules, which is Robert Mueller's life, plays it by the rules, cannot match what Donald Trump will do to the rules.
It turns out, I mean, I think we went into thinking about this, that, Bob Mueller was a straight arrow, and he would take on the crooked guy. But at best, I think it's a draw.
Michael Wolff, thank you very much for Volume 2. Really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.